Today, we're going to dive into a field that really flipped psychology on its head. It shifted the entire focus from what's broken in us to what makes us strong. So yeah, let's explore the science of what actually makes life worth living: positive psychology.
You know, when you hear the word psychology, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a really long time, the answer for most people would have been something about therapy or disorders or dysfunction. But is that the whole story? Is the entire field just dedicated to figuring out what's wrong with us?
And look, for most of its history, that was kind of true. Psychology operated inside a disease-patient framework. Its main job was to repair damage, to look at our damaged habits, our troubled childhoods, our brains. The field essentially became what some critics called a victimology, studying us as if we were just passive beings, kind of pushed around by our past and our problems.
Now, don't get me wrong, this approach led to some incredible breakthroughs in treating mental illness. It did a lot of good. But it also left a huge part of the human experience completely in the dark. It focused on getting people from, say, a -8 to a 0, from sick to not sick. But what about getting people from 0 to a +8? What about helping people flourish?
The person who really brought this question to the forefront was the psychologist Martin Seligman. And the spark for this massive shift, this whole new field of science, well, it didn't come from a lab or some academic paper. Nope. It came from a conversation he had in his garden with his 5-year-old daughter. So the story goes, they were out weeding, and Seligman got annoyed and yelled at his daughter, Nikki. And her response was just a total revelation for him. He realized his whole life's work was about fixing what was wrong, and he'd brought that same grouchy mentality home to his own parenting. But Nikki, she had identified a negative habit in herself, whining, and decided to change it. She wasn't just fixing a weakness, she was actively building a strength. And that single moment, right there, gave birth to the core idea of positive psychology. It's not about ignoring the bad stuff, not at all. It's about taking a scientific approach to understanding human strength and human virtue. So the crucial takeaway is this: shifting goals. Treatment isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's also about building what's right.
So how does this new field organize itself? Well, it basically rests on 3 pillars of experience. First, it looks at our relationship with the past, focusing on how we can find satisfaction and contentment with what's already happened. Second, it digs into the present, exploring happiness and that amazing experience of flow, when you're so totally absorbed in something that time just disappears. And finally, it looks to the future, with the goal of building real, grounded optimism and hope.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds great, but while the science of positive psychology is pretty new, the questions it's asking, they are as old as humanity itself. For thousands of years, cultures all over the world have been wrestling with this exact same question. What does it actually mean to live a good life?
Let's just take a quick look at 2 of the biggest traditions that have thought about this for centuries: the great philosophical paths of the West, like the ancient Greeks, and the deep spiritual traditions of the East. Okay, so a really fundamental difference between these two is where they start. Western thought, generally speaking, puts the individual front and center. It values things like personal achievement, freedom, and independence. Eastern thought, on the other hand, often prioritizes the group, emphasizing things like cooperation, being part of a community, and your duty to others.
And that core difference creates a totally different relationship with time. Western cultures tend to be very future-oriented. We value strengths like hope and optimism that help us build a better tomorrow. In contrast, many Eastern cultures are more past-oriented, placing a high value on the wisdom of elders and the lessons of history to guide how we live right now.
This even shapes how we see reality itself. Western logic often relies on this either-or way of thinking. Something is either good or bad, right or wrong. But Eastern thought, which you can see perfectly in the yin-yang symbol, embraces an and framework. Light and dark, good and bad, they aren't fighting each other. They're interconnected, essential parts of a bigger whole.
But here's the really amazing part. Despite all these different approaches, just look at what happens when you list out the core virtues from these traditions. Athenian, Judeo-Christian, Confucian, Buddhist. You see this incredible convergence. Courage, justice, wisdom, compassion. It's like no matter which path they took, humanity independently kept arriving at the same shared understanding of what it means to be good.
So all this ancient wisdom, all this modern science, it brings us right back to the present. How are we actually doing when it comes to living this good life?
Well, the data is pretty sobering. Studies have found that only about 17% of adults are considered to be in a state of flourishing. That means they have consistently high levels of mental and emotional well-being. Think about that. That means for over 80% of us, there's a big gap between just getting by and truly thriving.
And this is exactly why the mission of positive psychology is so vital. What it argues is that focusing only on the negative, which was the old way, well, that's just as incomplete as only focusing on the positive. Both approaches, by themselves, are telling just half the story of what it means to be human.
So the ultimate goal here is to develop a psychology of the whole person, one that studies the complete human condition by looking at both sides of the coin. It's an approach that doesn't just ask what's wrong with you, but also asks what's strong with you. It acknowledges the stressors in our lives, for sure, but also focuses on building up the resources we need to overcome them.
Which really leaves us with this final question to think about. Positive psychology doesn't say one is better than the other, but it forces us to ask, in our own lives, and even as a society, where are we putting most of our energy? Are we just focused on fixing what's broken, or are we also dedicating real time and effort to building what's strong? The answer to that? Well, it might just define our potential to truly flourish.